welcome. I really hope you've had a chance to listen to Johnny Got His Gun this week. It's a really extraordinary broadcast from March 9th, 1940. Not nearly as famous, I think, as War of the Worlds. It's based on a 1939 novel by Dalton Trumbo. It eventually also became a film, I think, 1971, and Trumbo also wrote the script for that. So the radio script was written by Arch Oboler, very prolific scriptwriter for radio, and this particular Oboler piece stars James Cagney in what is basically a one-man show against war, and yet it's even more than just an anti-war piece. What I'll talk about today is the way in which this particular piece of radio is a kind of meditation on the birth of radio and the need for communication during a period of great unrest and disappointment. Last week, I briefly made the point that early radio was often very meta-theatrical. That's a kind of theater that's very self-referential. Right? That radio talks about itself or re-emphasizes itself as radio, like in War of the Worlds, where Orson Welles reimagines this novel as a kind of increasingly urgent series of emergency broadcasts interrupting regular radio programming. And with Welles, I think it is used to point out radio and this medium's potential for misinformation and its destructive power. This kind of meta-theatrical navel gazing is something that I've noticed in other media as well when they emerge. So weirdly enough, my two other things, which have nothing to do with radio, my two other areas of study really are drama, especially ancient Greek drama, and opera. And if you look back at ancient Greece and the birth of tragedy there, what you see are the plays are repeatedly contemplating what a chorus should do, the purpose of what a motive is, or why we put on masks, or how to be a good spectator. And if you're familiar with any Shakespeare plays, you also know that during that rebirth of drama in early modern England, he saturates his play very famously with theatrical language about staging and costumes and transformation, and also this repeated trope of the play within a play. Like in Hamlet, there's the play that Hamlet stages, or the beginning of Taming of the Shrew. There's another sort of set of a play within a play. Shifting then from England to Italy, same time period, the birth of opera, Venetian composers and literati used the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice for the first operas. And again, this is a kind of meta-theatrical moment. That's basically to turn music into active drama. They choose the story of a musician, Orpheus, who's called to heroic action, the saving of Eurydice. So again, the story mirrors the medium. And that's very similar to what is going on with Johnny Got His Gun. And one of the main reasons that media tend to be meta-theatrical and self-contemplative is that they, in their early stages, they work as a kind of self-advertisement and a way to acclimatize audiences to a new medium. I said last week that I'd love to talk about Edgar Bergen and his dummy, Charlie McCarthy, that the most popular show on radio during the late 30s was a ventriloquist show. Now, there are lots of reasons for that. Radio took a lot of people from vaudeville, and so McCarthy and Bergen and other people as well, like Jack Benny, came from vaudeville, and so they made the transition from vaudeville to radio. But I think another reason why it's so popular is because this idea of the ventriloquist made people really comfortable with the concept of radio, right? That basically radio is kind of the electrical version of ventriloquism. You both have wooden objects endowed almost magically with the power of speech. The dummy is powered by the vent's arm, the ventriloquist's arm, and the radio by the electrical cord. The sound of the dummy originates from the ventriloquist, and the sound of the radio comes from the radio tower. And so one of the reasons that I like to think that this show was popular was because it was a way of introducing people and saying, look, if you can understand how this works and enjoy it, you can understand how this works and enjoy it. But then again, it could just be what my students always say. It's just people will believe it. Johnny Got His Gun is also meta-theatrical. And the story of the character Joe Bonham is really the story of how Joe wants to communicate with the outside world, to receive and eventually send signals and vibrations and waves. He has no eyes, no ears, no mouth, no nose, but he can still feel. That's to say, he is sensitive to vibrations or waves. And in this way, he is a receiver, and he eventually learns how to become a transmitter of waves. In other words, he becomes himself a radio. Let me just this little passage towards the end of the show where he says he's praying to God. Make sure that I can share this with everybody.
And I don't blame you for getting behind in your orders. Nobody's perfect, but what I want is such a little thing. All I want you to do is to take a tiny little idea that's in my mind and put it in her mind 2, maybe 3 feet away. That's all I want, God. Just a little idea that's in my mind and put it in her mind.
It's that. Taking the little idea that's in my mind and put it in their minds. If I could just communicate this over distance, if I could only reach them, yeah, I don't know how to. And so much of this show is about how do I reach people? How do I reach out? How do I engage? So if you remember, the first thing that he feels like he has to do in order to reach other people is he has to get hold of time again, because he's lost track of it. He's been cut off from his past by this traumatic event of a bomb dropping. Here's that.
It's such a little thing. Mother, where are you? About the days you're living through. That's important, see? But all I remembered was dive in the dugout and then... And that was all. A day in September 1918. And that's all.
And repeatedly throughout the broadcast, either Joe cuts himself off or sound gets cut off, like the high-pitched hum of the medical instruments. You hear things sort of going off, and then suddenly, or there's the pitch that goes, and what he does and what Oboler is doing again and again is kind of reenacting this traumatic moment where Joe is essentially cut off from the rest of the world. And he reenacts it over and over and over again. But then, once he gets hold of time again, he is able to reconnect with the world. And we have this beautiful sort of lyrical passage where he experiences for the first time in a long time a sunrise, although he can neither see it or smell it.
Time stopped then. 8 o'clock. So all I got to do is... My heart stopped. My breath stopped. I knew it was happening. Slow at first, crawling along my skin. Warmer and warmer, the rising sun. In my room. In my room. I'd won. I'd won. I'd caught up with time again. The sun. It was dawn. It was dawn for the world and for me. I could smell the dawn. Yeah, me without a face lying there, and the smell of the dew on the grass, and me without eyes, shading my eyes and seeing the sun coming up over the mountains back home, and the hills going pink and lavender like the inside of a seashell. The sun warming my little piece of skin, and me seeing without eyes the town where I was born, and me without ears hearing the lowing of the cows waiting to be milked, and babies kicking in their cribs and rubbing their eyes with their fists. It's sunrise, and I've got it. And now I'll always know when it's sunrise, and they can't take it away from me. Thank you, God. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So it's a really sort of moving passage where he sort of literally reconnects with the whole world through the rising of the sun. After he reconnects to time, he can then receive communications from the outside world, but he still hasn't yet learned how to reconnect and send the communications until the generals come and give him a medal, and he realizes through this that if he can feel their vibrations, then others could receive his vibrations. In other words, he knows what it is to be a receiver, and he finally realizes, oh, I can transmit as well. Play that.
All the generals heard was the blowing of the air and the tube in my throat. When I heard the vibrations of the footsteps that said they were going, I began to think. The vibrations. Up to now, I thought only of the vibrations coming to me. How about making my vibrations go to them? Yes, vibrations to them. A footstep on the floor is a kind of vibration. The tap of a telegraph key is another kind. I had it. I had it. When I was a kid, Bill Harper and me, we had a telegraph set. We used to telegraph to each other. Dot dash, dot dash, dot dash, dot. I remember the code, the Morse code. All I had to do to break through to the people outside was to lie in bed and dot dash to the nurse. I could give messages and receive messages. I raised my head from my pillow. I dropped it. Then I did it twice quickly. That was it. With my head, raise my head, let it fall on the pillow. The Morse code. S.
So he realizes finally, I can make myself understood. And the message that he wants to deliver to the rest of the world is an anti-war message. How horrible war is, even when it's for a great cause. And he becomes sort of at the end very spiritual and compares himself to Christ and sort of mixes together this sense of a very material world of vibrations and sensations with sort of spiritual world. That kind of mix of spirit and mind and matter and science and the ineffable is very much a part of radio almost since its invention. And it was shaped a lot, again, by the cultural context in which radio kind of grew up in the early 20th century. One of the most vocal and influential radio enthusiasts was a man named Sir Oliver Lodge. He was a scientist and inventor responsible basically for for solving some of the basic problems of radio tuning, right? How you can tune into a station. It's Lodge who learned and taught us how to do that. Oliver Lodge also had an interest in spiritualism, and he was a very outspoken supporter of science, of seances. So this man of science, very respected, very successful, also believed in seance. one of the reasons why he was so interested in seances is that, like many other parents during the first third of the 20th century, Lodge had lost a child to the First World War, his youngest son, Raymond. And in part, I think this was Lodge's way of grasping at keeping his son's memory alive. Unlike other people, though, this sort of spiritual belief coexisted with his scientific inquiries. And he argued that basically radio carried to us the voices of those who were far away in the physical world, right? So it could also carry to us the voices of those who were far away in the spiritual world, namely the dead. So he believed that radio was more than just sort of a scientific parallel to the spiritual seance. It could even be a gateway. And he argued, in fact, that it might be possible to contact the dead not only through a human medium, the seance, the person, but also through a technological medium, the radio. And as someone sort of deeply invested in applying tuning techniques to radio, Lodge seemed to think that the only problem was finding the right frequency with which to, as it were, dial in the dead. So he believed that basically if you could find that number on the dial, you could speak to those who were dead and gone. And Johnny Got His Gun is very much about somebody else who's trying to overcome time and to communicate in a broken world. Joe is cut off from his past, his present, his future. He's really a member of the lost generation. He's traumatized, and like other young people of that time and friends of those young people, he feels unconnected. But so also did those who, these people left behind, like Oliver Lodge. And what they wanted to find was a way to communicate, and sometimes communicate beyond the grave. And if you look at some of the writings about early radio and the early phonograph, they're really interesting because people who write about them are very fascinated by the fact that these instruments, these technological instruments, will now preserve the voices of the long dead, and we'll be able to, as it were, communicate with them beyond the grave. Or as Joe puts it, the nearest thing to a dead man.
You for the trouble. They've never seen nothing like me. I'm something you can really holler about. I'm the dead man who's alive. The live man who's dead. I'm the man who made the world safe for democracy.
So this idea that he is simultaneously alive and dead, again, building on these kind of Christian motifs, but also feeding into this desire to speak beyond the grave and speak to somebody beyond the grave. Ultimately, though, Joe even goes further than that. And what he wants eventually is a medium that's even more powerful than radio. And what he says in one of his spiels towards the end is, he says, build a glass case for me, show me around, let me tell them, and let them see me. What Joe's talking about here is he doesn't want just radio, he wants television.
Just what I'm going to tell you. It may be my last chance. I've got it. I've got it. Listen, you up there. I'm tapping it out with my head. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. Let me out. I can earn my keep. I can do a job like anyone else. Take me out of here and build a glass case for me so people can see me. Take me in my glass case to the beaches, to the county fairs and the church bazaars and the circuses and the traveling carnivals. You'll do a wonderful business with me, and I could pay you for the trouble. They've never seen nothing like me. I'm something you can really holler about. I'm the dead man who's alive. The live man who's dead.
So ultimately what you have in Joe is it's not just meta theater. He also, and this sort of extraordinary, groundbreaking radio show, is also calling for a newer medium, even newer than itself. And this is something that media also do. Um, right? They seem to outgrow themselves, and especially the more avant-garde and the new wave of things, outgrow the old medium, and they desire to express themselves in a new way. And so at the end of the broadcast, we have not just radio being called for, but the invention of television. That's really how Joe wants to go out and preach his message. Thank you.